creatures whose gaze could turn flesh into stone, a flourishing kingdom swallowed by the sea before sunrise, a sea beast so immense that exhausted sailors climbed onto its back, believing they had reached solid land. For generations, stories like these shared the same fate. They were dismissed as myths, fairy tales, impossible inventions from people who supposedly knew no better. But history has a habit of changing its mind. Time after time, discoveries buried beneath the earth have forced archaeologists to revisit legends once written off as fantasy. Ancient storytellers were not always inventing impossible worlds. Sometimes they were preserving fragments of reality that science would only understand thousands of years later. 1. Lycaon. Greek mythology tells of a ruler named Lycaon, whose arrogance reached so far that he decided to challenge Zeus himself. According to the legend, Lycaon secretly served the god a meal prepared from human flesh, believing he could deceive the ruler of Olympus. The deception failed. Zeus recognized the crime instantly. In a burst of fury, he destroyed the king's palace and transformed Lycaon into a wolf, a punishment said to mark the birth of the werewolf legend. For centuries, scholars regarded the tale as nothing more than a moral lesson: cannibalism, divine justice, the dangers of defying the gods. Few imagined that the story might preserve a memory of something real. Then archaeologists began excavating Mount Lycaon, the very sanctuary ancient writers linked to Lycaon. The discovery of a temple was expected. The discoveries within it were not. Mixed among the ashes of ritual offerings lay burned human bones, alongside the remains of sacrificed animals. Radiocarbon dating placed them nearly 3,000 years in the past. More importantly, the evidence suggested this was no isolated event. Whatever rituals took place on that mountain appeared to have been repeated over generations. Suddenly, the myth looked different. Perhaps Lycaon was never created to explain an imaginary curse. Perhaps the legend survived because people were trying to make sense of rituals they had actually witnessed. 2. No creature in Greek mythology is more recognizable than Medusa. One glance into her eyes, the stories claimed, was enough to transform a living person into stone. Historians usually interpreted the tale as symbolism, a warning, a metaphor, an artistic expression of fear. But myths often begin with observation before they become legend. In northern Tanzania lies Lake Natron, one of the most chemically unusual lakes on Earth. Its highly alkaline waters preserve animals in an extraordinary way. Birds, bats, and other small creatures that die there can dry into rigid forms that appear almost carved from rock. To modern science, the explanation is straightforward. To an ancient traveler, it would have been unimaginable. Imagine discovering lifelike animals frozen in place along the shoreline. With no understanding of chemistry or mineralization, a monster capable of turning living creatures into stone would seem like a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe Medusa was never inspired by a woman at all. Maybe the legend was born from people trying to explain a landscape they could not possibly understand. 3. One of the most mysterious cities described in ancient tradition is Irem of the Pillars. According to the account, it was a magnificent city that disappeared so completely that later generations doubted it had ever existed. For centuries, many scholars treated the story as allegory rather than history. Entire cities, after all, do not simply vanish. Then satellite imagery transformed the search. Beneath the deserts of Oman, researchers identified ancient trade routes converging on a forgotten settlement. Excavations revealed the remains of Ubar, once a thriving center of the frankincense trade. The greatest surprise, however, lay beneath the city itself. Geological surveys revealed that the settlement had been built above an enormous underground limestone cavity. As the rock slowly dissolved over centuries, the ground eventually gave way. Buildings, streets, walls, entire sections of the city collapsed into the void below. Whether Ubar is the Irem described in tradition remains debated, but the discovery demonstrated something remarkable. Sometimes a city really can disappear almost without a trace. 4. Few armies understood fear as well as the Aztecs. Victory did not begin when weapons collided. It began long before the first blow was struck. Ancient accounts describe warriors carrying strange instruments into battle objects, capable of producing sounds so disturbing that they shattered an enemy's nerve before the fighting even started. For centuries, historians assumed the descriptions were little more than dramatic embellishment. Every civilization, after all, liked to portray its warriors as terrifying. Then archaeologists uncovered a series of unusual clay artifacts inside Aztec burials. Many resembled human skulls. Others had grotesque, twisted faces frozen in expressions of agony. No one knew what they were. Museums catalogued them as ceremonial objects. And for decades they remained little more than curiosities. Everything changed when researchers finally blew air through one. The sound was unlike anything anyone expected. It wasn't musical. It wasn't pleasant. It resembled a human scream, a desperate, agonizing cry that instinctively triggers alarm. Modern acoustics suggests the whistle produces chaotic frequencies remarkably effective at capturing human attention and provoking unease. Now imagine hearing not one dot but hundreds before sunrise, echoing across a valley, growing louder with every step of an advancing army. Suddenly, the ancient descriptions no longer sounded exaggerated. The whistle wasn't designed to entertain. It was built to terrify. Long before psychology became a science, the Aztecs had already learned how to wage war against the human mind. 5. Luxury meant something very different to Emperor Nero. Gold-covered walls were not enough. Exotic feasts were not enough. Even architecture itself had to obey his imagination. Ancient Roman writers claimed that one dining chamber inside Nero's palace rotated continuously, while guests enjoyed their meals. As the platform slowly turned, diners experienced the illusion that the heavens themselves were moving overhead. The story sounded absurd. Medieval copyists repeated it. Renaissance scholars questioned it. Modern historians often dismissed it as another example of Roman excess transformed into legend. Then excavations beneath Rome revealed something unexpected. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of an enormous circular mechanism built directly beneath Nero's palace. Stone rollers, carefully engineered supports, hydraulic channels designed to keep the entire system functioning. Together, the evidence pointed toward a startling conclusion. The room really had rotated. Nearly 2 millennia ago, Roman engineers created a moving dining hall not because such a thing was necessary, but because an emperor wanted to place himself at the center of the universe. Sometimes the most unbelievable stories survive simply because reality was already extraordinary. 6. Sailors have always been accused of exaggeration. The farther they traveled, the larger their stories became. None seemed more impossible than the kraken. According to Norse tradition, this creature was so enormous that exhausted crews mistook it for an island. Ships anchored beside it. Men climbed onto its back. Some even built fires before realizing the island had begun to move. It sounds impossible, yet the ocean still hides animals we rarely witness alive. Among them is the giant squid, one of the least understood creatures on Earth. Adults can reach astonishing sizes, yet almost everything we know comes from damaged carcasses or encounters with sperm whales. Those whales regularly surface bearing circular scars left by powerful tentacles, evidence of violent struggles that take place far below the reach of sunlight. Human beings have observed remarkably few healthy giant squid in their natural environment. For most of history, anyone who encountered one unexpectedly would have had no vocabulary to explain what they had seen. They reached for the only language available, myth. The kraken may never have matched every detail of the legend, but perhaps the legend began with a real creature emerging from a world humans barely understood. 7. For more than 2,000 years, the Hanging Gardens have occupied a strange place in history. They were celebrated as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, yet no one could prove they had ever existed. Ancient writers described terraces stacked high above the ground, overflowing with trees, flowers, and flowing water, a green mountain rising from the heart of Mesopotamia. It sounded magnificent. It also sounded impossible. Archaeologists searched the ruins of Babylon for decades. They uncovered royal palaces, massive walls, temples, administrative buildings, but the gardens were nowhere to be found. Gradually, a new theory emerged. Perhaps the world's most famous garden had never existed at all. Then Assyriologist Stephanie Daly revisited the ancient records from a different perspective. What if historians had been searching in the wrong city? Her research suggested that descriptions traditionally linked to Babylon matched another capital far more closely, Nineveh. There, The Assyrian king Sennacherib described an extraordinary royal garden supplied by an elaborate network of aqueducts and water-lifting technology unlike anything seen before. Suddenly, details that had puzzled scholars for centuries began to make sense. The engineering, the landscape, the water supply. None of this proves the mystery has been solved, but it raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps one of history's greatest wonders never disappeared. Perhaps we simply spent centuries looking for it in the wrong place. 8. Some stories become so famous that people stop asking whether they ever happened. The tale of Troy was one of them. Heroes, gods, a wooden horse, a war lasting 10 years. To many scholars, it belonged alongside mythology rather than history. Then an unlikely man decided to test the legend. Heinrich Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist. He was a wealthy businessman with an obsession. He believed Homer's poems contained genuine geographical clues. Guided by those clues, he began digging into a hill called Hisarlik in present-day Turkey. What emerged changed archaeology forever. Beneath the soil lay not one ancient city, but an entire sequence of civilizations built one above another across thousands of years. Among them was a settlement destroyed by intense violence during the Late Bronze Age. Burned structures, broken fortifications, weapons scattered among the ruins. Archaeologists continue to debate whether this city represents Homer's Troy. Yet the broader conclusion is difficult to escape. A wealthy fortified city really did stand where the poet said it would. And it really did meet a violent end. Legend had preserved the memory. Archaeology uncovered the evidence. 9. Rome expected rebellion. What it did not expect was Boudica. After Roman officials humiliated the Queen of Thessaly and brutalized her family, she united neighboring tribes in an uprising that shook the empire's grip on Britain. Ancient writers claimed entire cities disappeared in flames. Tens of thousands died. To later historians, those numbers sounded suspiciously dramatic. Victorious empires often magnify the strength of defeated enemies. But beneath modern London, the ground preserved its own testimony. Excavations repeatedly uncovered the same unmistakable layer. Thick deposits of ash, charred timber, burned household goods, collapsed Roman buildings. Every discovery pointed to the same narrow period in the early 1st century. Today, archaeologists recognize it as the Boudican destruction horizon. It stretches beneath much of Roman Londinium. Long after written records faded into history, the city itself continued telling the same story. Whatever happened during Boudica's revolt, it left scars that still survive underground nearly 2,000 years later. 10. Almost every civilization remembered a time when giants walked the earth. They appear in the Bible, in Greek mythology, in Norse sagas, in countless traditions separated by oceans and centuries. Most historians regarded the pattern as symbolic. Giants represented power, chaos, the forces humanity struggled to control. But legends rarely emerge from nothing. Medical science offers another possibility. Throughout history, a tiny number of people have developed gigantism, a disorder that causes extraordinary growth. Today, such individuals are well documented. In the ancient world, they would have been almost unimaginable. Picture a farming village where the average adult stood little taller than 5.5 feet. Then imagine a stranger arriving who towered more than 7 feet above the ground. No medical explanation existed. No hormones. No endocrinology. Only stories. Perhaps the legends of giants were not invented to explain impossible beings. Perhaps they began with rare people whose appearance seemed impossible to everyone who met them. 11. Greek writers spoke of women who hunted from horseback, mastered the bow, and fought beside men as equals. They called them the Amazons. For centuries, the idea was treated as fiction, heroic fantasy, nothing more. Archaeologists occasionally unearthed female skeletons buried with weapons, but those discoveries were often dismissed as symbolic. Then the evidence became too consistent to ignore. Across the vast Eurasian steppe, researchers opened burial mounds belonging to the Scythians. Again and again, women appeared beside swords, spears, arrows, and riding equipment. Some skeletons carried unmistakable signs of combat, healed fractures, embedded arrowheads. Injuries sustained in battle and survived. DNA testing removed any remaining doubt. These were women, and they had lived as warriors. The Greeks may have embroidered the stories over time, but the people who inspired those legends almost certainly existed. 12. For centuries, sailors returned from distant oceans with the same unbelievable claim. They had seen women living beneath the waves, half human, half fish, beautiful enough to lure entire crews toward disaster. Most people assume these stories belonged entirely to folklore. Yet one of history's most famous explorers recorded something remarkably similar. On January 9, 1493, while sailing through the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus wrote that he had seen 3 mermaids rising from the sea. He also added an unexpected detail. They were far less graceful than the legends suggested. Columbus was not describing a fairy tale. He was documenting what he believed he had witnessed. Today, marine biologists think they know what caught his attention. The animals were almost certainly West Indian manatees. Viewed from a distance, especially after weeks at sea, a manatee lifting its head above the surface while holding its calf can create a surprisingly human silhouette. Add exhaustion, hope, and the tendency of the human brain to recognize familiar shapes, and a myth begins to take form. Perhaps sailors weren't inventing mermaids. They were trying to explain unfamiliar creatures in a world where imagination often filled the gaps left by knowledge. 13. Few stories appear in more cultures than the tale of a world-consuming flood. Mesopotamia remembered Utnapishtim. The Hebrew Bible tells of Noah. Greek tradition speaks of Deucalion. Hindu texts preserve the story of Molnid. Civilizations separated by continents all remembered water swallowing the world. Coincidence? For generations, many scholars believed so. Floods were common. Every society experienced them. Naturally, similar stories would emerge. Then geology introduced another possibility. Some researchers proposed that around 5600 BC, rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus, rapidly flooding what is now the Black Sea basin. If that interpretation is correct, entire communities would have watched their homeland disappear beneath advancing water. Survivors scattered. Their descendants settled in different lands, yet they may all have carried the same memory, not of an ordinary flood, but of one so immense it seemed to erase the entire world. The hypothesis remains controversial. Even so, it offers a remarkable explanation for why so many civilizations remembered a catastrophe that sounds strangely familiar. 14. The life of Alexander the Great inspired countless legends. One of the strangest claims, he descended beneath the sea inside a transparent chamber. There, according to medieval accounts, he explored an underwater world no ordinary person had ever seen. Historians naturally dismissed the story. A glass vessel surviving beneath the ocean sounded impossible. Yet the underlying technology was surprisingly simple. A diving bell traps a pocket of air as it is lowered underwater, allowing a person inside to breathe for a limited time. Variations of this idea have existed since antiquity. Aristotle even described similar devices used by divers. Does that prove Alexander made such a journey? No. But it changes the question. Instead of asking whether the story was impossible, we begin asking whether it might have been exaggerated from something that was entirely achievable. History is full of legends that grow around real inventions. 15. In the spring of 1950, workers cutting peat in a Danish bog made a horrifying discovery. A man's face stared back at them. His features were so perfectly preserved that they assumed he had died only days earlier. Police were called to investigate what looked like a recent murder. The truth was far stranger. The victim had been dead for more than 2,000 years. Today we know him as Toland Man. His body survived because the acidic, oxygen-poor environment of the bog slowed decay almost to a standstill. Even the contents of his stomach remained intact. On his neck rested a carefully fashioned leather noose. His expression appeared calm. His eyes had been gently closed. Nothing about the burial suggested panic. Everything suggested intention. Ancient Roman writers described ritual sacrifices among northern European tribes. Their accounts were long dismissed as propaganda. Then Toland Man emerged from the earth. He did not prove every ancient story true, but he demonstrated that some rituals historians had doubted were, at the very least, entirely possible. For centuries, we believed myths existed because ancient people did not understand the world. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. What if myths were not attempts to escape reality, but attempts to explain it? Again and again, archaeology uncovers places once thought imaginary. Geology explains disasters once blamed on angry gods. Biology reveals the real animals hidden behind legendary monsters. History has not proven every myth true. Far from it. But it has shown something far more interesting. The line between myth and history is far thinner than we once believed. Every generation assumes it has separated fact from fiction. Yet every generation discovers that some of yesterday's legends were simply truths, waiting for evidence. So the next time someone tells you an ancient story is impossible, remember this: that ancients were often wrong, but sometimes they remembered something the rest of the world had forgotten. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten edge of history, subscribe, because there are still countless mysteries waiting beneath the surface, and many of them may turn out to be true.